You may be seated. If you have a Bible this morning, I want to invite you to turn with me to the book of John, chapter 8. We're going to be in John chapter 8 at the end of the chapter. If you didn't bring a Bible, there should be one in the pew or the chair back in front of you. If you use that one, this passage is on page 895. But I'd love for you to turn there. We're looking in the Gospel of John as we're in this series called Explore God. We're actually in the Gospel of John last week. Pastor Clark was helping us to answer the question, why does Christianity seem so narrow or so exclusive? And so we looked at John chapter 14, where Jesus proclaimed that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. You know, if you just heard that statement from Jesus, it is quite a bold statement to say that he's not a way or a truth. He is the way, the truth. He's implying that he is the only way, that no one comes to God, no one can be with God except through him. But even if you just heard that bold statement by Jesus, you might still be left with a question, well, in what way is he the way? In what way is he the truth? Is he just here, maybe as I was saying to the kids earlier, just as a prophet, here to speak God's truth to us? Was he just a messenger from God? An example of God to show us what it looks like to get to God, to show us how to walk along the way, to set an example that we are to follow. This is the way that many different religions and belief systems over the last 2,000 years have spoken about Jesus. Many have said that he's a prophet. Some religions have said he's the most important of all the prophets. Some have said that he was a really enlightened person. He taught a lot of really important good things. He set a really good example that if everybody just lived like Jesus lived, then our world would be a better place. And those things are true. People have said some true things about Jesus and what he was doing in part, I think. One thing I think that you'll find interesting is that you won't find many people throughout history, and even till today, who say Jesus didn't exist. Most people, if you talk to them, they think that Jesus of Nazareth, this person who lived 2,000 years ago, really existed. In fact, not too long ago, I was listening to a podcast. It was by a couple of historians. They aren't Christians. In fact, they were filming or recording the podcast around Christmas time. And they went on to talk about how they don't believe in the virgin birth. They don't believe that Jesus was probably even really born in Bethlehem. So they're not defenders of the Christian faith, but they both said that they don't know of any credible historian who denies the fact that Jesus actually existed. Most people throughout history and even today believe that this person of Jesus actually existed. The question is, well, who was he? What did he come to do? And for the last 2,000 years, Christians have consistently said that Jesus is God. That while Jesus was truly a person, born of a woman, lived on this earth, ate and drank and slept and did all the things that people do, that he was also truly God. He was God in the flesh. And so it raises a number of questions that people ask, saying, well, is this true? Is there any proof? Did Jesus ever even claim this himself? Is there any good reason for me to believe that Jesus is God? And if so, if he really did claim to be God, or if he is God, what does that have to do with my life today? I mean, how does somebody who lived a couple of thousand years ago, who claimed to be divine, what does that have to do with me today? And so that's what I want to try to answer in our time together. I want us to see what Jesus said about himself. I want us to see the implications of what that those claims are, and also not just the implications, but also the application for our lives. And so I want us to go to Jesus' own words in John chapter 8. We come to this passage and it's this kind of heated discussion between Jesus and the religious leaders of his time. And we're kind of jumping in at the middle of their conversation, but I think you'll understand enough just from what we read. What's the nature of this discussion and why are the people so mad at Jesus? So John chapter 8, we're going to pick up in verse 48 and read to the end of the chapter, which is verse 59. It says that the Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham who died? And the prophets died. Who do you make yourself out to be?" And Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Now, can you feel the tension in that conversation, this dialogue that's happening? I mean, it begins with them calling Jesus some very unnice things by calling him a Samaritan, but then saying that he has a demon. Not that he is some prophet or that he is some enlightened good teacher, but saying you must be demon possessed. And then the conversation ends with them wanting to stone Jesus. Like they actually pick up rocks and have them in their hands ready to throw at them until he departs from their midst. What made them so angry that they wanted to kill Jesus right there? What brings such tension in this conversation? Well, it's who Jesus is claiming to be. It's what he is saying about himself. And so that's where I want us to begin is what did Jesus claim? And one thing that we see here is that Jesus claimed to be divine. That's the first thing. If you like to follow along in the notes that are in the bulletin, you can, or if you just want to listen as we walk through this passage. But I do want you to note that Jesus claimed to be God. He claimed to be divine. Jesus actually did this a number of different times throughout his ministry. Another way that Jesus did that apart from this passage was Jesus proclaimed forgiveness of sins. That's significant because you and I know that only the offended party can offer forgiveness, right? If someone steals from you or someone gossips about you, you don't really care if another friend forgives them. You're the offended party, right? If the wrong's been done to you, then it's really your prerogative whether or not you're going to give forgiveness. We know that. The people of that day knew that. And so to offer forgiveness of sins, to pronounce someone as being forgiven of their sins by God, was to claim to be God. Many other religious teachers, even still today, will tell you how you can get forgiveness from God. But Jesus was the one who looked at people in the eye and said, "You are forgiven. Your sins have been forgiven." That's a claim to be God. So he's done this all throughout his ministry. This is part of what's led to the tension here in their conversation, but we see it right here in our passage. If we pick up in verse 56, towards the end, I think Jesus has already said some things claiming to be divine, but it's really clear at the end of the passage. He says in verse 56, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." And so the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old. And have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." This is a really interesting statement by Jesus for a number of reasons. One of them is the fact that Abraham lived 2,000 years ago. And so when Jesus speaks about the fact that he knows Abraham or that Abraham knows him, is a claim to be beyond just this 30 years that Jesus has lived on the earth since being born in Bethlehem. He is saying something about himself chronologically, if you will, to say that I have existed for more than just this 30 years that you've been able to observe me in this world. But not only is he making a claim chronologically, but he's also making a really interesting claim in terms of priority or importance. Notice that he reminds them that Abraham is their father. And notice who they keep talking about. They refer to the prophets in general, but they keep talking about Abraham specifically because Abraham was the father of the nation of Israel. He was the beginning of this whole family from which they descended. He was the one that they traced themselves back to. And Jesus is saying, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. In other words, you guys like to look back to Abraham, but Abraham was looking forward to me. You see, there was an important claim here that he is much more important to their faith, to who they are as a people, than their father Abraham. And so Jesus is making some unique claims about himself that's getting the people quite upset. But I think the most clear claim to be divine comes at the very end of what Jesus says. The last two words of verse 58. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Now that's a kind of awkward grammar, if you will, right? Like, wouldn't you expect him to say, before Abraham was, I was? That would make a lot more sense. But Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. In the original Greek language, those words are ego I me. But in the language that Jesus would have originally spoken in, these words actually meant the name of the God of Israel. You might remember when God revealed himself to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, he spoke of himself as I am. This was the name Yahweh. This was the name Jehovah. When Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, he is identifying himself as not just a God, but as the one true God of Israel. And this was most upsetting to the people. This is why they picked up stones right then to kill him, because he is claiming to be their God. Now, I think sometimes a lot of objections or questions will often arise when we hear that Jesus claimed to be divine. And so I kind of want to unpack a couple of different ideas real quickly that I hope might answer some questions that might be going off in your mind or speak to some objections that you might be having. So one side of it is we need to realize that in Jesus's world, during Jesus's time, this was not a unique claim. So one thing that you'll see in your notes is that these claims, the claim to be divine, were not unique during this time. Sometimes I think we as like modern people, we read these things and we live in such a secular society that we really struggle to believe that someone would claim to be God. Like if someone just, came into our city, even if someone just stood up in a church and said, I am God in the flesh, we would write them off as probably a crazy person or someone who's just lying about their identity. And so sometimes we read that and we think, man, would Jesus ever even say this about himself? What you have to realize is back then, there wasn't such a divide between the physical and the spiritual. People weren't so just naturally skeptical of claims of spirituality. In fact, in the broader world that Jesus lived in, these claims were not unique. I mean, think about it. The Greek Empire was still, having its effects in the world. Now the Roman Empire in Jesus' time is taking over. Both of those cultures believed in many different gods. Both of those cultures believed in people who were maybe half God and half man. There were many times people claimed to be God during this time. In fact, I was reading that there's a Roman historian named Tacitus. He's probably one of the best historians of Rome that we have. And Tacitus wrote about a man named Mauricus. Mauricus was from Gaul. He was considered the champion of Gaul. And Mauricus, he claimed to be a god. Mauricus lived probably a couple of decades after Jesus, and he was claiming to be a god, and he wanted to lead a revolt against the Roman government. And so he gathered 8,000 men as a little army unto himself. That's quite a few more than Jesus had during his time. So Mauricus gathers 8,000 people, and he leads this revolt against the Roman government. And of course, it fails because Rome's got this huge army and lots of power. And so the Roman authorities actually give him over to the wild beasts. But Tacitus writes that the wild beasts would not eat him. And so many people thought, well, maybe he really is a god. You see, there's a lot of claims going on during this time that people would have claimed to be divine. People would have claimed to be from God, or people would have claimed to be a god or the God. And so when we look at this and we say, would Jesus have ever even said that? It's probably because we're reading through a really modern lens. But if we were to go back and see this in its kind of cultural reality, it would make a lot more sense that somebody would be saying these things. But then there's kind of another side to it that I also want to present to you. That there's a sense in which these claims were not unique during this time, but there's also a sense in which these claims were blasphemous amongst Jesus's people. That's another thing that I want you to notice here, that these claims were not unique if you're talking about the kind of the Greek world or the Roman Empire. Lots of people were believing in many gods, and many people were probably claiming to be gods at different times. But yet, amongst the Jewish people, they did not believe in a pantheon of gods. The Jewish people, part of their core beliefs was something called the Shema. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 6 that you are to hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That to claim to be God was to be as far blasphemous as you could be. I mean, you think about it. What is the very first commandment for the Jewish people in their 10 commandments? It was that you shall worship no other gods. You shall have no other gods before the one true God. Well, Jesus could have claimed to be a prophet. He could have claimed to be a rabbi or a good teacher. He could have even tried to maybe reform the Jewish system of that day. He could have claimed to be the anointed one, the Messiah that had been promised. And none of them would have been as blasphemous as to claim to be God. This is why whenever he says, before Abraham was, I am, identifying himself as the God of Israel, they were ready to kill him. Because while these claims were not unique, they were blasphemous amongst the people. And I think it's really interesting that it leads us to a certain place. There are certain implications about Jesus' claim. I guess I wanted to spend this beginning of the time trying to say, if you're skeptical that Jesus ever even made these claims, we have a lot of evidence, not just from scripture, from outside sources. I think we have a lot of evidence from just the culture of that time that this is why the people of the Jewish establishment of that time were so upset with Jesus. This is part of why they ultimately did put him to death. Because Jesus was claiming to be God. So what does that mean? What then are the implications of this claim? Well, I would say that Jesus' claim to them, Jesus' claim, it forces us to make a decision. So when Jesus was claiming to be God, as he was before the people of that time, he was forcing the people to make a decision about who he was. Jesus was not leaving a lot of wiggle room, if you will, where people could look at him and say, oh, I really like his parables, but I could do without the blasphemy, Like you think about the most kind of polarizing figures in our world. This would have been Jesus, that he is making such bold claims, making such blasphemous potentially claims, that he's not leaving a lot of middle space for the people. People are having to make a decision, and I want to present to you this morning that I think we're in still the same position today. That when Jesus said these things, he was kind of forcing us to not just remain kind of neutral on who he is, but it forces us to make a decision. One way that we could decide it would be that if Jesus isn't who he claimed to be, if Jesus isn't God, then we have to come to the fact of the reality is that he has deceived billions of people. If Jesus isn't God, he has deceived billions of people. That's the next thing that you'll see as we think about the implications of this claim. It forces us to make a decision about who Jesus truly is. Because if Jesus isn't God, the fact of the matter is he's deceived a lot of people. I mean, think about over the last 2,000 years, how many people have given their lives to the belief that Jesus truly is God. Think about how many people have not just devoted their lives, but even been willing to be put to death over this claim that Jesus made. How many people have given their money, have given their time, have given all that they had with this belief in Jesus. And in fact, the Apostle Paul writes later in the New Testament, not talking about Jesus' divinity exactly, but speaking about the fact that if Jesus isn't who he claimed to be, and if he never really raised from the dead, then all that we believe as Christians is pointless. This is what he says in verse 14 of 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. See, if we get really personal with it, if Jesus isn't God, then he's deceived all of us who are in this room who have claimed to believe in Jesus, who are Jesus followers. We've given our money, we've given our, at least Sunday mornings, we've given other times with this belief that he is who he says he was. And so we don't really have the position, I don't think, to say, well, you know what? his parables were really powerful, and we could learn a lot from them. His teachings were really helpful. I mean, the golden rule, you can apply that just anywhere and it's good. He did set a really good example, and if we just follow that example, then the world would be a better place. Sure, all those things might be partly true, but if Jesus isn't really God, then he has made fools out of each one of us. And really, it wouldn't be right to call him a prophet from God. It would probably be much more accurate to call him a liar. Jesus is forcing us to make a decision. The decision is, well, if he isn't God, then he's really deceived a lot of people. But if Jesus is God, then he is deserving of our worship. If Jesus isn't God, then we have to wrestle with the fact that he's misled a whole bunch of people, including ourselves. But if Jesus really is God, then he is deserving of our worship. If Jesus is God, then glorifying him or worshiping him isn't breaking the very first commandment. It's fulfilling the very first commandment. I think this is why Jesus, throughout this passage, speaks about the fact that God the Father is going to glorify him. He says this in different places, but one of them is in verse 50. Towards the beginning of the passage, Jesus says, I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Jesus is saying, God the Father, the God whom you worship, the God whom is over all, he is the one who is going to glorify me. Now, again, if Jesus isn't God, then why would the Father seek his glory? But if Jesus is God, then it would make the most sense for the Father to seek his glory, because to glorify Jesus is to glorify God. To worship Jesus is to fulfill what we were created to do, to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. This is why Jesus came. And if Jesus is God and he is deserving of our worship, then we should treat him as such. I mean, if Jesus really is God, he should not just be a consultant in your life. Jesus doesn't deserve just another seat at the boardroom table of your life, kind of where you would weigh his teachings and his advice with all the other things that you kind of hear in the world. If Jesus is really God, then the only proper response is to surrender all and to worship him as if he is God. But do you notice how there's not really a middle ground when it comes to Jesus? Some people won't really listen to Jesus' claims. They won't really consider what he said about himself. But if we really take the time to take Jesus at his own words, it forces us to say, well, he's either deceived a lot of people or he's truly deserving of our worship. The question is, what do you believe? What do you believe about Jesus? Where do you stand on this idea? There's certainly applications for our lives today. That's kind of where I want us to end, is I want us to realize that Jesus made these claims. Those claims, the implication of them, I think, is that it forces us to make a decision about who Jesus is. But from there is application. That Jesus' claims do make a difference in your life. That's the final kind of truth I want you to consider this morning. Jesus' claims are not just some kind of theological or philosophical ideas. They're not just something from a couple thousand years ago when you kind of wonder, well, what does this really have to do with me today? No, Jesus' claims, the fact that he is saying that he is God, it makes a really profound difference in your life, in each and every day of your life here on earth and for the life still to come. So there's probably many ways that Jesus' claims make a difference for your life, but I just want to draw out two that I think we see in this passage. The first is that Jesus' claims offer you a secure identity. Jesus' claims to be God, they make a difference in your life. And one of the ways that they make a difference in your life is that Jesus offers you a secure identity. I don't know if you ever noticed this, if you ever read the Gospels or the accounts of Jesus' life, but Jesus is remarkably humble. He's very patient with people. He's very kind. I mean, I know here he's calling people liars, but you can almost hear it in his voice that he's not like angry even at the fact that they're saying he has a demon. Like he's speaking truth, but he always seems to be doing it in love. I mean, I think this is why people who even aren't Christians will sometimes read the Gospels and say, yeah, this Jesus guy is really a great example for us to follow. I think the reason that Jesus was able to live in that sort of way, to be kind to people, to be gentle with people, to really live a life of humility, was because he knew who he truly was. His identity was secure. Again, a couple of times in this passage, Jesus talks about God glorifying him and him not seeking his own glory. We were just looking at that in verse 50, but he makes a similar claim in verse 54. Notice that Jesus says, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say, he is our God. You notice what Jesus is saying there? He's saying, if I have to work to promote myself, if I have to work to glorify myself, to find some validation and worth in it of myself, then it's really nothing. But if the God whom you worship, the God who created all things, the God who reigns over all things, if he glorifies me, then it means everything. It doesn't matter if you say that I have a demon. It doesn't matter if you want to pick up stones to kill me, if you want to run me out of town, whatever you might say about me, I know what the God of the universe says about me. You see, this gives Jesus a position to say, I don't need to validate myself in what I do. I don't need to glorify myself because I know what God says about me. You see, the reality is we all need affirmation. We all need people to affirm our value and our worth. We are always looking for other people to affirm who we are. And so many times we do that by promoting our own glory in the way Jesus says that he wasn't. You ever know somebody who's always kind of saying things to impress you, always kind of giving you their resume so that you know their accomplishments and what they've done? It's because they're looking for you to validate that what they've done matters. They're looking for you to affirm that they are important and valuable. And again, that's something we all need, but what Jesus is saying is, it doesn't matter what you say because I know that God says those things about me. And this is the same thing that Jesus is offering to each one of us. Jesus is offering you a secure identity in not what the world will say about you, but in what he says about you. Not in what other people will say, but what in God the Father will say. You see, if Jesus is just a prophet, he might be able to tell you how to get to God, but you've still got to get there yourself. You've still got to prove your worth and that your fact that you're good enough. If Jesus is just a good example, but you've still got to follow it, your identity is still not set. You still got to get other people to tell you, yeah, you're following Jesus well enough. You're acting like a really good Christian. But Jesus is not just a prophet or a good example. Jesus is God in the flesh to say, I'm here to tell you what God thinks about you. I'm here to unite you to myself, that where I am, you might be also. I'm here that you might be adopted into God's family so that you know no matter what happens, he calls you his son or his daughter. Jesus is here to give you an identity that is not shaken by what people say about you or what happens in your life, but one that is true because of what God says about you. You know, throughout this series of Explore God, we've been involving testimonies so that we might hear from members of our church that these aren't just abstract ideas, but that these are ones that are very personal, that we wrestle with. And so as we were thinking about this idea of Jesus being God and how that offers us so many things, but especially a secure identity, I asked Georgia Davis if she would share a testimony with us this morning. So would you invite Georgia, welcome her as she comes forward.
Hi, church. My name is Georgia, and my husband, Philip, and I have been coming to FirstSF since we moved to San Francisco in 2015, and we've added 2 kids along the way. Today, I'm sharing my story of how Jesus Christ gave me a new life and a new identity. My parents immigrated from China to the United States before I was born. My dad was a full-time grad student, but both my parents held multiple jobs to try to make ends meet. When my mom became pregnant with me, they worried whether they had enough money to raise a second child. They scheduled to have an abortion, but thankfully, my mom saw a poster for a crisis pregnancy center at the grocery store. She decided to go, and the staff helped with resources like groceries and hospital bills. My mom struggled with the decision, but in the end, she decided to keep me, and here I am. Reflecting on this story has been confusing at times. On one hand, I'm grateful to be alive, but on the other hand, I've struggled with feeling truly loved and wanted. It wasn't until later that I came to know the God who rescued my physical life and who would give me a new spiritual life with him. In middle school, my parents continued to struggle with financial burdens, and over time, their marriage deteriorated. My parents fought often, and eventually my dad left and started a new marriage. Because divorce was taboo in our culture, nobody talked to me about what was happening, and I was told not to tell anybody else. None of my friends knew about my home life, and I kept pretending everything was okay. But inside, I felt crushed. I was abandoned, angry, and desperate for love and attention. I thought, if my own dad couldn't love me, then who can? The same year my dad left, I was invited to a church called REM, Rockville Evangelical Mission. I'd always been curious about Christianity, and I just assumed there was a God out there. I just didn't know who he was or whether he cared for me. From the first time I visited that church, I felt an overwhelming sense of love and belonging. The leaders and young adults at that church made an effort to get to know me. They gave me rides to youth group, they gave me books about Jesus, and they invited me into their home for dinner. It was through their love that I sensed the love of God, which made me want to know him more. I started reading the Bible and praying, and I quickly learned that God is a father to the fatherless, and through Christ, I could be adopted into his family. It took many years for God to heal me of my fears of being abandoned and unloved. It also took many years for me to be freed from the sin of anger, resentment, and unforgiveness. I still feel the weight of these things at times, but I know that they are just shadows of my old life. In Jesus, I have a new identity as a beloved daughter of God and a co-heir with Christ. Because of Christ's perfect life, I don't need to prove myself worthy to be loved. Because of his death on the cross, my sins and the effect of other people's sins have been put to death. And because of his resurrection, I have a new spiritual life. Jesus has redeemed my life so that both my past and my future have a new purpose in him. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Georgia.
Jesus' claims make a difference in your life. They can make a difference in your life today, offering you a secure identity. They also make a difference for the future. So the last thing I just want you to know this morning is that Jesus' claims, they make an offer to you for a secure eternity. Jesus offers us a secure identity while we are here on earth and seeking to understand who we are and whose we are. But Jesus also offers us a secure place in eternity. Again, if Jesus is a prophet, he can offer you good advice on how to get to God, but if he is God in the flesh, come to you. Then he offers you a secure place to be with him forever. We see this in what Jesus says, again, in the middle of early in the passage, in verse 51, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." When Jesus says there, if anyone keeps my word, he's not saying if you do all the things I tell you to do, but rather if you believe what I am saying, that I am the great I am. If with your whole life you believe that I truly am God, then you will never taste death. We ask, wait, is he talking about the fact that you're never going to die from this earth? But no, Jesus said that for many people, they will have to lay down their life physically here on earth. They were going to die for the sake of following him. No, it's not that we are saved from death on this earth. It's that we are saved from the death of being separated from God forever. That when Jesus rose from the dead, as Georgia was saying, his resurrection gives us new life. When Jesus rose from the dead, he was showing us that not only was he God, but that we can be with God forever. Earlier, I read from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when Paul says, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then all that we believe and all that we do is in vain. But he goes on to say this in 1 Corinthians 15. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has also come the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Paul says, because Jesus is God, because he died on the cross to pay for your sins, and because he rose from the dead, that death here on earth is actually just like falling asleep, because you will be with God forever. Jesus confirmed his claim to be divine in many different ways throughout his life. He turned water into wine. He cast out demons. He healed people. He calmed storms. But surely the most impactful and important way that he confirmed his deity was raising from the dead. Earlier, I mentioned to you a man named Mauricus, who we read about from Tacitus. I mentioned that Mauricus, the wild beasts wouldn't eat him, so people thought maybe he is a god. But then after the wild beasts wouldn't eat him, the Roman authorities had him executed. And guess what? No one follows Mauricus anymore. I mean, there's no army, there's no 8,000 people. Why? Because he stayed dead. Why does Jesus have billions of followers over the last 2,000 years? Why does he continue to see more people follow him around the world each and every year? Because Jesus got up from the grave. Jesus was also put to death by Roman authorities, but he did not stay dead. And when he rose from the dead, he confirmed the fact that he truly is God, but he also confirmed the fact that you can be with God forever if you trust in him. Jesus' claims make a profound difference in your life today and for all of eternity. So would you trust in him today?